All right, everybody. We are going to come on back and keep on moving here. We've got plenty of information and conversation left for you today, and want to move to the next piece of content for you. It was really good to hear from Jake, one of the authors of Growing Young, and where Sticky Faith kind of runs into Growing Young. And as we talk about how Growing Young is not just a youth group program, but really a culture change piece. And I like one of the ways that one of my colleagues talks about it. He talks about Growing Young as the operating system for your church. And a way to do church that's different. We really are talking about what does it look like to help your congregation think differently about young people and focus on young people in a more significant and more influential way. And in order to do that, it's really helpful to have Scott Cormode with us to talk to us about congregational change. You should have received one of the things that Scott wrote about mixed messages and what chaos brings. Zach's going to put that in the chat, has already put that in the chat. If you haven't read that, that's fine. We have Scott here, and Scott's going to help us understand a little bit more about that. He's going to be utilizing page 7 through 9 in your packet. Scott is a professor of leadership here at Fuller Theological Seminary. He's the author of 2 books, including one called The Innovative Church, and I would highly suggest that you check that one out. And you can find that one. I know we might have a link to that, and that'll drop in the chat. He speaks about leadership all over the country and sometimes the world, and has been a consultant on change and change management. He's a close partner with FYI, and every major project that we have done, Scott has had a voice in, and we are so grateful to have him. I will set up what Scott will probably tell you, and that is this. Scott loves to take questions, absolutely loves it, because some of this stuff, we don't want to miss the things that you need to hear about leadership. So please chat them in, and we are going to find the appropriate time for Scott to connect there. And know that Scott will pause periodically to take those questions as well. So you all are getting an opportunity to meet Scott Cormode. Scott, I will turn it over to you. Lead us as we continue on in this process.
Well, thank you. It's always good to be here, and I got to say that one of my favorite things to do is to talk to some of the folks from FYI. So I'm happy to be here. I will tell you that I like to be interrupted. You are used to professors who stand behind a podium with a PowerPoint presentation, and once they get in, they'll say, save your questions for the end. I'm the opposite of that. Now, I remember one time I was doing this with FY, and immediately a hand shot up. I'd said that for 10 seconds ago. I said, oh, great. What's your question? He goes, no, I'm just testing you. So I just want you to know I like to be interrupted. And the first thing I would love for you to write down, if we were doing this in a room, I would have this written in big, giant red letters, and that is this phrase: leadership begins with listening. Leadership begins with listening. The stereotype is that a leader is somebody who speaks. And yes, leaders will need to speak at some point, but leadership has to begin with listening. And so for the first part of our conversation today, I want to talk about leadership begins with listening, and I want to talk about who do we listen to, what do we listen for, and how do we listen well? Who do we listen to? What do we listen for? And how do we listen well? So I'm going to pause there because sometimes somebody wants to just jump in with something at that point. I'm not seeing anybody, wave your arms or write something in the chat. Okay. Well, I'm going to keep going. Leadership begins with listening. Who do we listen to? Well, first and foremost, we listen to God. And we listen to God in three ways. We listen to God for the whisperings of the Spirit. We listen to God through Scripture. And we listen to God through the impact of other Christians on our lives. We have to lead in community. Now, if I'm going to talk to you about this leadership stuff, I should probably talk to you a little bit about my biblical worldview of what Christian leadership is. I'm a professor of leadership. And my first understanding of it is shaped by 1 Corinthians 3:6. If you read 1 Corinthians 3:6, it says, Paul planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. Now we've got a little drama going on here with three little characters in this story, Paul, Apollos, and God. Which one is the most important in this story? Please say God. Because if you don't, we're going to pause and we're going to have a different conversation. Paul planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. I would argue that Christian leadership is planting and watering. Christian leadership is planting and watering. What do I mean by that? It is creating an environment conducive to growth. But Christian leaders cannot ensure an outcome. My grandfather was what the Bible would call a steward. He had a 140-acre citrus ranch that he was in charge of that belonged to an absentee landlord. And my grandfather's job was to make the orange trees and the lemon trees grow and to produce fruit. Could my grandfather make those trees produce fruit? No. What could he do then? He could create an environment conducive to growth, but he could not make the trees grow. If you know how trees work, for example, in the springtime, the flowers, the buds come out, and those flowers will eventually grow into fruit. But every so often, every 5, 10, 20 years, something, a big wind would come along right when those flowers were on the tree and blow some of those flowers off the tree. And then you had a much smaller harvest simply because those flowers never became fruits. Could my grandfather control the wind? No. He could make sure there was enough water. He could do all sorts of things. But ultimately, there was no guarantees. I want to say to you from the beginning, whenever we talk about Christian leadership and whenever we talk about change, there are no guarantees. What you do is you plant and you water, and then you turn your people over to God. And that's all you can count on, is you plant and you water, you try to create an environment conducive for growth, and then you turn your people over to God. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. How to plant and how to water and how to turn your people over to God. Now I'm going to pause. I'm not seeing any questions, but I'm going to make sure that if anybody wants to say something, this is what a liberating message. It is both liberating and terrifying at the same time. It cannot depend on me, but it also means I don't have control. But that is what every single Christian leader since Jesus has had. All they could do is plant and they water and they turn their people over to Jesus. And then God gives the increase. Now, it doesn't take away our responsibility. We need to plant and water. But that's what we're going to be working on today, is how to plant and water. So the first question we're going to ask is, who do we listen to? Well, the first thing is we listen to God. But the second thing we do is we listen to the people entrusted to our care. You're going to hear me say this phrase, the people entrusted to your care. Probably hear me say that 37 times today. Because I believe that Christian leaders do not have followers. Jesus has followers. But every Christian leader instead has people entrusted to their care. They belong to Jesus. Just like those trees belong to an absentee landlord, but they were entrusted to my father's or my grandfather's care, in the same way, every person you care about belongs to Jesus, and they are entrusted to your care. That's a completely different thing than having followers. I don't get to tell people what to do based on my authority. My authority is I can simply do what God calls me to do. I have to point this out because, well, oftentimes Christian leaders ask me, how do I make people do what they don't want to do? And we're going to actually, 6 months from now, when we come back together, I'm going to talk to you about leadership, and we're going to ask, how do you help people change who desperately need to change, but desperately don't want to change? We'll get there. But the first thing that I need to tell you is Christian leaders don't have followers. Jesus has followers. We only have people entrusted to our care. So I'm going to pause there because no one has jumped in, and I'm going to kind of poke you a little bit and hope somebody wants to say something.
I'm going to use the silence as amens, Scott. So
okay,
keep on
going to keep going.
I'll give a verbal amen. I'll give a verbal amen.
Now we're
Okay,
talking.
thank you. So the first thing we said is Christian leaders don't have followers. Who are the people entrusted, or who do we listen to? We listen to the people entrusted to our care. The second question we're asking is, what are we listening for? So if we said, who do we listen to? Now do we say, what do we listen for? And what I want to suggest to you is that what we listen for are the longings and losses that make up the human condition. What do I mean by the longings and losses that make up the human condition? There are some things about being a human that are really, really wonderful. And there are some things about it being a human that are really, really hard. Now, if we had more time, I would have you watch a short video. Pixar did a piece, there was a short that won an Academy Award that was called Bao, B-A-O. And it tells a story of a old mom who is sad that her son has grown up and left the house. And as she's making dumplings, one of those dumplings turns into a little boy. And she cares for that little boy. And it's a story about that. And it's just very darling. But what's really interesting about this is that eventually she realizes that it's all just a dream. And that's part of how she's processing the fact that her son has grown up and moved away. So let's pause for a second and just think about this idea that every parent has children that they love, that grow up, and that is wonderful. And every parent experiences the fact that as children individuate, they become separate from their parents, which is both wonderful because what we wanted, and terrible because we are losing something that we love. And that is, we could be talking about this in Des Moines. We could be talking about this in Seattle. We could be talking about this in Shanghai, in New Delhi. We could be talking about this in Iraq. We could be talking about this in Africa. We could be talking about this in Colombia and South America. We could be talking about this anywhere there are human families. This idea of things that are wonderful and things that are terrible that are human, things like individuation. And so pay attention to how the people entrusted to your particular care experience this. Now, if you wanted to be able to get a whole book, I can't reach up over, I'm looking at my book right there, on just that question, wouldn't it be great if Kara Powell and, I don't know, Brad Griffin had written a book on 3 questions that every teenager is asking. And those 3 questions are about identity, belonging, and purpose. And so when you hear me say, what are the things that we need to be paying attention to? There we go. Thank you, Andy. About the things we need to be paying attention to. Think about all these longings and losses as focused on identity, belonging, and purpose. Oh, wait, something came up in the chat. So when Paul says, imitate me as I follow Christ, the arrow is always pointed to Christ through our lives. They don't follow my life, but they follow the reflection of Jesus in my life. Amen. And it's not just that they don't follow me. It's that I can't fulfill the promise of the gospel. You see, I would argue that the gospel is God's response to the human condition. There are things that are true of every human that are wonderful, things we were created to be. And there are things that are true of every human that are ghastly and difficult. And the gospel is God's response to the human condition. And so if I try to get them to follow me, I can never fulfill the promise of the gospel. I did not die and rise again. I could not fulfill what the gospel requires. Only Jesus can. And that's why we point to Jesus. I'm going to keep going. So, first question, who are the people entrusted to my care? Second question is, what are the longings and losses of those people? If you plant and create environment for growth, there will always be people that Dawn.
Sorry, I was trying to finish it. I'm so sorry. I was just trying to type it quickly. I hit the wrong button. My apologies.
Well, just
so we
say
know
it.
we, we can't, you can't force people to change, right? You create the environment and you try to create an opportunity for people. So in your experience, when there is always people within a church context that will take up the mantle and run with something, but there are always people who will push back or just not catch the vision and not run with that. So what has been your experience, or what is your input about those people and still trying to connect them into
I'm going to give you
what you're planting?
This is such a great question. We're going to devote the entire time that I'm with you next time to that question. So I will give you the really short answer now. And the really short answer is, first, a quote from Ronald Heifetz, that people don't resist change, they resist loss. And so part of what we do is figure out what the loss is and how to respond to that. That we'll have a whole conversation about that next time. Keegan is smiling, like, licking his chops, because he loves all of this stuff. And we're gonna get to that next time. And part of what's going to happen is I'm going to say a little bit more now, and then we're going to talk about mental models, and I'm going to talk specifically about how to invite people into new mental models, even when they don't expect it. So I'm going to keep going because I feel like we're headed in the right direction on this one. So who do we listen to? We listen to God. We listen to people entrusted to our care. What do we listen for? We listen for the longings and losses of the human condition, especially identity, belonging, and purpose. And how do we listen well? That's the third question that we ask. And that's, yeah. And yes, Zach wrote in the chat that if you want to go into more detail, what I'm doing here is chapter 3 of the Innovative Church. The first, if you want more on this, I hate to sound like the guy who's hawking his wares on late night. This turned into an infomercial, but I don't have. time to go through all of this, but if you're interested in those questions, Dagmar, chapter 8 of the Innovative Church is specifically designed to answer exactly the question that you're asking. And what we're doing today is chapter 3 of that book. So how do we listen well? Well, we listen with empathy. But I need to tell you what empathy is. If you want to talk about empathy with your people, I would love for you to just don't do it now, but at some point Google the name Brene Brown, and Connor just went and got the book. I could tell. There we go. Google the name Brene Brown and the word empathy, and there'll be a little 4-minute video that comes up that is just wonderful. I'm going to tell you about that video because Brene Brown distinguishes between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is when I recognize your feeling. Empathy is when I feel it with you. Sympathy creates disconnection. Empathy creates connection. So what do I mean by feeling with you? Well, let's say that, I don't know, I'm going to pick on Jen. I'm going to say, pretend Jen is a 15-year-old in your youth group. And she has just been dumped by the only boyfriend she has ever had. And let's say she's come to talk to me about it. Now, on the one hand, I have never been a 15-year-old girl. So I can't really feel the exact same things that she is feeling. But I have had things that I desperately wanted and that were part of my identity. And I've had them taken away from me. And I know how devastating that is. If Jen can, and so when Jen tells me this story of her being dumped, what happens is I can call up in myself these feelings of when I felt that way about something different. And when she can see on my face that I feel what she's feeling, that's empathy. That creates a connection. That is transforming. Let me give you an example about a growing young example. I'm looking over at the Growing Young book, like you can see it right there. This is a story that's in one of the chapters. In one of the chapters, there's a story that Jake and Kara and Brad tell as if it's about somebody. They don't tell you the name. It's actually about my daughter. This is a story that I have regularly told at Sticky Faith and now here, and they tell it in the book. When my daughter was 14 years old, she decided she didn't want to be in the youth group anymore. She'd rather be in the adult choir. And so every Wednesday while the youth group was meeting, I would take her to choir practice. Well, there was a couple in our church, Lee and Patricia, who said, I noticed that you drive every week to take her to choir. We drive right past your house. Can we pick her up and take her? Sure. And it was started out as simply a carpool. But here's what they did. Leadership begins with listening. They listened to my daughter. And so for the 10 to 15 minute drive to church and the 10 or 15 minute drive back, they just got her to talk, which was not hard. And she would talk about her life. And that was great. She felt understood. She felt like they had empathy. Well, a year or so later, my wife was diagnosed with cancer. Very serious cancer. Now, she's okay now. But for a while there, it was real touch and go. And there was no one in my daughter's life that was not touched by this cancer, except Lee and Patricia. And so she could talk about that and what she was feeling for 10, 15 minutes a week on the way there and 10, 15 minutes a week on the way home. They just listened to her. What difference did this make? When my daughter was about to graduate from high school, she was 18 years old, and Mother's Day came along. So a month before she graduated, she made a Mother's Day card for her mother. She made a Mother's Day card for each of her grandmothers, and she made a Mother's Day card for Patricia. And then she went off to college. And on Sundays, Lee would sidle up to me at church and say, so how's our girl doing? He acted like he had some kind of ownership for my daughter. And you know why? He'd earned it. He'd earned it by listening. My daughter is now almost 30 years old. She's married. When she comes to visit us, and I'm glad to say that she does come to visit us, when she does, she very rarely connects with some of her friends from high school. But she almost always makes a point to see Patricia. Leah has since passed away. It makes her feel like this is part of my youth that I still need to connect to. That is the essence of what they talk about when they say somebody outside your family that cared for you. Empathy. How do we listen well with empathy? And now if you're taking notes, please write down the next sentence. Empathy cannot want control. Empathy cannot want control. Let me give you 2 examples. First, as a dad, I remember at times when I would go and talk to my daughter, she'd be in her room, she'd be in high school, and I thought she should be doing her homework, but she was worried about something or other, I don't know, some friends or something, whatever she had on her mind. I wanted 2 things at once. I wanted to understand her on her terms. And I wanted her to get back doing her homework because that was important. I wanted to control her behavior. And because of that, I was bad at listening. Let me talk to you about how that plays out in the church. I was doing a consulting job where I was working with a church in the Pacific Northwest. And it was one of those churches that, the average age was like 70, 75. And they wanted to be reaching out to young families. And they had only one really strong young family in the church. So they invited that person to come to the church board meeting and to talk. And at one point he said, I would find it very uncomfortable to invite my friends to this church. Because if I did, I'm afraid that you would freak out just by listening to them talk about the things that they do normally. And there's a kindly old woman sitting next to him, and she turns to him and she says, we really want to hear this. He's going, I don't know. If you just heard my friends talk about things the way they normally talk, I think you'd freak out. She goes, no, tell us. And so he paused and he said, well, okay, for example, if you were to listen to my friends talk, they would just, as a matter of course, use the phrase gender fluidity. And no one in the room freaked out. And she turned to him and says, we don't know what that means. And so he started to explain what gender fluidity meant. He got like 2 sentences in. And all of a sudden, on the other side of the room, one of the elders just interrupted him and thundered, there is the kingdom of God and there is the kingdom of this world. And you have just brought the kingdom of this world into the kingdom of God. And he wouldn't be interrupted. And he filibustered for 15 minutes about how important it was to not bring the kingdom of this world into the kingdom. Now, remember, this guy's first point was, if my friends talk the way they normally talk, you will freak out and drive them away. And to prove their point, they freaked out and drove him away. Empathy cannot want control. So okay, that's what you don't do. What do you do? We were doing one of these kinds of things with a group one time, and I was saying empathy can't want control. And one of the small groups that we were working with, the churches from Florida, said, we do, when we're teaching our people, we do empathy lessons. They gave their volunteer staff empathy lessons. And that was so successful that the parents heard about it and they said, we want some of that. And so they ended up doing a whole empathy session for parents. And one of the things that they said is, never listen to a young person without a bottle of water in front of you. What do you mean? She said, well, every single time you want to say to that person, yeah, but, instead, take a sip of water and say, tell me more. Every single time you want to say, yeah, but, Take a sip of water and say, tell me more. Empathy cannot want control. So what do we do? Who do we listen to? We listen to God and the people entrusted to our care. What do we listen for? We listen for the longings and losses of the human condition. And how do we listen well? We listen with empathy. Now, I want to do one more thing, and no one has interrupted me yet, so I'm just going to keep going until somebody
You do have a
interrupts.
question in the chat there, Scott.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit of what you're talking about. And Connor's asking the question, do you feel like there's a difference between the language of being relatable and being empathetic?
I was having this conversation, and I was having this conversation with the people that run the youth group at my church. And I quoted Growing Young. So if I quoted it at my church, I can quote it to you. One of the things that Growing Young says is warm is the new cool. Have you come across that yet? Have you talked about that at this group yet? You'll get there. Warm is the new cool. And so you're going to talk about what it means to be warm, right, Chuck? I mean, that's in their future, like today.
Yes, that is in their future.
Okay, good. And because what was happening is the couple that was doing the youth group at our church, he is a theologian and she is a mom. But they were volunteering and they were working with young people and they were worried because they weren't cool. But what they were was deeply empathetic. And I could explain to them that about what warmth looks like. And you will hear about that today. And they could say, yeah, that's what we do. And I could say, the people at the Fuller Youth Institute will tell you warmth is far more important than being relatable or being cool. You know, Lee and Patricia were 75 years old. They had absolutely nothing in common with my 15-year-old, but they listened to her, and that changed everything. They were not relatable in any way at all, except for the fact that they chose to listen, and that changed everything. I'm going to pause and I'm going to do one more thing on mental models. I'm going to do it very quickly. Mental models are the categories that we use to make sense of the world. They're how we think things should be. So if I were to say to you, what's your mental model of a car? You would picture a car in your head. I don't know what car you pictured, but it probably had a windshield. It probably had a steering wheel. It probably had, so somebody says, we are people really saying to leaders, what are people really saying to leaders in the church during times of change when they claim you are not listening to us? What they're saying is we do not feel empathy from you. You don't have to answer our questions, but you need to understand them and you need to validate them. You need to legitimate them. As long as people feel like you are asking legitimate questions, that they're asking legitimate questions, they will feel understood. This is where Fuller Youth Institute says, doubt is not dangerous for students. Unexpressed doubt is dangerous. What gets people to feel comfortable expressing their doubt? It's when they feel legitimately understood. So back to mental models. Your mental model of a car probably had a steering wheel or, something like that. If I showed you something that didn't have a steering wheel or didn't have a windshield or, didn't have tires, I don't know what that thing is, but it ain't a car. The reason this is important is we are at this conference trying to change your mental model of what youth ministry is. The most powerful thing you can do when you lead is change somebody's mental model. So I'm going to pause and tell you a story about Jesus. It's okay if we talk about Jesus here? I hope so.
Please talk about Jesus.
Okay. So in Mark chapter 8, the Gospel of Mark is written in such a way that it all aims up to a point, and then everything pivots at that point, and then after that, everything aims at the cross. And I want to point you that pivot point. That pivot point is at the end of Mark chapter 8. Jesus turns to the disciples and says, "Who do you say that I am?" Or sorry, who do people say that I am? In other words, what mental models do they use to make sense of me? They're trying to figure out who's Jesus. And the disciples say, well, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah. So the mental model that people are using is you're one of those prophets. You're not just a rabbi, but you're like a prophet. And then Jesus turns to the disciple and says, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you're the Messiah. And Jesus says, very well done. Good, you get a gold star. Didn't last long for Peter. Because then Jesus says that the Son of Man must go to Jerusalem and suffer and die and rise again 3 days later. And scripture says, and he explained it to him very plainly. And because he was changing their mental model, because he was so wise, I am sure that the disciples immediately understood, right? No, the disciples did not immediately understand. Peter says, no, you have misunderstood the job description of a Messiah. Let me explain to you what your purpose on earth is so that you can get it right. And Jesus says, get me behind me, Satan. And he says, if anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. If anyone wishes to save his life, shall lose it. He must lose it. But anyone who loses his life for my sake and the gospel shall gain it. So now I'm back to the question that Dagmar asked earlier. Why did the disciples resist? People don't resist change, they resist loss. What was the loss involved in changing their mental model? And in this particular case, we have to bring one more person to the story. And that's Peter and James' mommy. Peter and James' mommy shows up in the scriptures. She comes to Jesus and she asks, when you come into your glory, may my son sit at your right and your left hand. What she was saying is she had a picture in her head that someday he'd be Messiah. And as a Messiah, he would be a conquering king. And as a king, he would have a palace. And in that palace, there would be a throne room. And in that throne room, there would be a big throne that the king would sit on. And next to that big throne would be little thrones for the people that were the best advisors. And she wanted her sons to get one of those little thrones. And now we know people don't resist change, they resist loss. What was at stake for the disciples? They weren't arguing about the mental model of a Messiah. They were arguing about the mental model of a disciple of a Messiah. Because in their mental model, the disciple of a Messiah got little thrones. What people don't resist change, they resist loss. What was the loss they were going to have to give up? They were going to have to give up their little thrones. So now we're back to your question. You're going to bring all of this back to your folks, and you're going to try and say, we want to change the mental model of youth ministry. Don't go back and say that. It will just freak people out. Instead, invite them into a story. Tell them a story like Lee and Patricia. Tell them a story. Listen to your people long enough that you can find somebody where there is people in your church who are already listening to young people. Tell them that story. Invite them into a story of what the new mental model would look like. Now, Chuck and Andy, it is 10:57, and at 11, I have to teach a class, and my students would like it if I'm actually there for that class. So I want to pause and say, are there any things I didn't cover or need to cover in the last minute and a half I have before I have to run to class?
I would say, because they have your paper already on mixed messages, if you can say any one or two sentences about competing commitments, sure, that would be super helpful.
So what happens is oftentimes we want to accomplish two things at once. We call those competing commitments. When we don't know how to handle competing commitments, we treat them like mixed messages. And you've just read about how dangerous that is. So what do you do instead? You narrate your competing commitments. You say to somebody, I want to both listen to you. Well, right now I'm feeling a competing commitment. I want to stay longer and interact with your people, and I want to be able to be on time to my class. I could just send a mixed message and say, you're really important, and then hang up and be done. And you go, well, if I was so important, why did you hang up? Or I could just narrate the mixed message and say to you, I want two things at once. I want to stick around and I need to go. And you would immediately understand what's going on. By narrating it, it just takes all the temperature in the room and drops it. Everybody goes, oh, okay, I can understand that. But you're going to feel the desire to send mixed messages. When you do, just narrate the competing commitments instead.
Super helpful. Scott, you are always a blessing. I've probably taken notes on this every single time that you have given it, and I have heard it. I always hear something new, and I'm reminded of the ways to shift my leadership. Thank you so much. And we are going to let you go so that you can be on time.
Thank you very much. You take care,
folks. All right. Thanks, Scott, so much. And I am going to hand it over to Zach. Zach is going to lead us into a break and a moment for you all to just reflect on a little bit of what Scott has shared, and possibly even read mixed messages if you haven't. We would encourage you to do that. Zach, have at it.
All righty. Thank you so much, Chuck. So it is break time. We're going to call you back at 11:15 a.m. Pacific time. That would be 2:15 p.m. Eastern time. Sometimes, as you can tell by my emails, I do get those confused. Thank you for your patience with that. If you have not yet taken the team assessment like we asked you to, you've got a few minutes here to do that. You will need the team assessment going into team time. You will need the team assessment after team time when you talk about the team assessment with your coaching group. So that's the afternoon, team time, coaching group time. And I'm chatting in right now instructions to take the team assessment if you have not already. If you still need to close it, please do so. And come with your report. If you have any questions about that, I'll stay on for a minute to field those questions. Otherwise, go to your break, get outside if it's not too cold, stretch your legs, get some water, whatever you need to do. Don't stare at a screen. We will see you in 15 minutes.